Hello everyone, I'm going to be breaking down my favorite commander deck, Varchild, Betrayer of Kjeldor. The power level of this deck is somewhere between a 6 and a 7, depending on your play group, and this deck wasn't built with a budget restriction, so we'll be going over total costs at the end of the video. First, let's take a look at Varchild herself. Varchild, Betrayer of Kjeldor is a legendary human knight. She's a 3/3 for 2 and a red. And her text says whenever Varchild, Betrayer of Kjeldor deals combat damage to a player, that player creates that many 1/1 red survivor creature tokens. Survivors your opponents control can't block, and they can't attack you or planeswalker you control. When Varchild leaves the battlefield, gain control of all survivors. The way I have the deck built, I take advantage of each of the parts of Varchild's text box in a different way. Firstly is her ability to give players tokens when dealing combat damage to them, so the deck will be at least one small part Voltron. The next is her static ability that prevents survivors our opponent's control from blocking or from attacking us, so another part of the deck will be a forced combat. Thirdly, and probably least importantly, is when she leaves the board, we take all of the friends that we've given to the other players for ourselves. So let's break this down and we'll look at the deck's Voltron package. Varchild gives your opponents a number of friends based on the amount of damage that she deals to them. So first and foremost, we need to buff her power. For this, I'm running Onaginata, which gives her +3/+0 in Trample. Tenza, Godo's Maul, a legendary artifact that gives her +3/+3 in Trample, as long as she remains red and legendary. Blackblade Reforged, which increases her power and toughness based on the number of lands we have on the board, and it's fairly cheap to equip to Varchild. And Sword of Vengeance, which gives her +2/+0, and also Trample, Haste, First Strike, and Vigilance, all of which are super helpful. Because she only makes tokens when she hits players and not creatures, I also have Prowler's Helm, Trailblazer's Boots, and Hot Soup, each would give her some form of evasion. There's a few utility equipment in the deck. There's Basilisk Collar to give her Death Touch and Lifelink to pad your own life if needed. And Fire Shrieker gives her Double Strike, which potentially makes her a lethal threat to creatures and players, as well as Swift Boots, which gives her Haste and Hexproof for protection. I'm also running Torbran, Thane of Redfell. He works well both before and after Varchild leaves the board, since he increases almost all of the damage we control by 2. And finally, I'm running Helm of the Host, which increases our Varchilds quite well. But you have to be careful with this. Any copy of Varchild that leaves the battlefield will return all of the survivors to you. So even if your token dies, you get all of your survivors. Related to this category, I also have a few lands that help us out in buffing Varchild in different ways. I have Hanwar Battlements and Flamekin Village, which both give creatures haste. I have Shinka the Bloodsoaked Keep, which can give a legendary creature First Strike, and Rogue's Passage, which can make a creature unblockable. The final thing I'll talk about in this category is closing out the game. Because Varchild dealing damage is the main way for our deck to make these survivor tokens, opponents have a very good chance to have quite a bit of commander damage. So I have a selection of extra combat spells. Savage Beating also can give your creatures double strike by paying an entwine cost, which makes almost any attack in the mid to late game lethal. Fury of the Horde, which can be cast for free. Scourge of the Throne, which is a little bit more difficult to use since it's a creature to contend with Summoning Sickness, and its extra combat step is a dethrone trigger, but it's still a flying 5/5. And finally I have Aggravated Assault, and with enough mana late game, it can give you more than one extra combat step. There's always a downside to using forced combat as a strategy to win, because if you go up against a creature deck, they can turn them on you. But since all of the friends you're giving to your opponents can't attack you, and because of Varchild's text, it does lessen the downside. Firstly, I run Fumiko the Low-Blooded, who works in 2 parts to force our opponents to attack, but also gets buffed when she blocks. I also run Goblin Spymaster, which is a little slower than Fumiko, but again only forces your opponents to attack. I also run Grand Melee, which works great in forcing blocks, the keyword here being if able, since Varchild prevents survivors from blocking entirely, as well as playing Rowan Kenrith, who's a versatile planeswalker because she can force a specific player to attack with her +2, or bolt a bunch of tapped creatures with her -2. Forced combat isn't the only thing we can do. We also have a couple of suggested combat cards with Angel's Trumpet, which is a very confusing card that basically gives all creatures vigilance, but any untapped creature that didn't attack, it taps and then pings the player who controls that creature. And War's Toll, which doesn't force combat, but it does make every swing a flunge, and it makes reactive decks much harder by tapping their mana. Related to this category, I'm running Bloodthirsty Blade from C19, which very cheaply can attach to an opponent's creature and goad it, forcing it to attack. The way we close out the game with forced combat is with Coat of Arms. All tokens that Varchild creates are the same creature type, so if the board is big enough and you've stuck a forced combat effect, Coat of Arms ends the game very quickly. And even if Varchild is removed, if you've amassed a large amount of tokens, you might be able to make a game-winning swing with that as well. The last thing I'll talk about in this section is how we protect ourselves from people swinging while we force combat on them. Crawl Space does this very well, limiting the number of creatures that can attack you to just 2, and Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs, which works as sort of a red version of Ghostly Prison, but instead creates blockers for each creature attacking you if the attacker doesn't pay tax. The next category I'm going to talk about is utility cards. Varchild's War Riders has the #1 spot in fun cards in the deck. Its cumulative upkeep cost fuels Varchild herself, meaning its downside is now an upside. Plus, being a 3/4 on turn 2 makes it a good blocker later on. For board wipes, I'm running Blasphemous Act and Disrupticorum, which both mesh well with our previous strategies, and Vandal Blast, as well as Chaos Warp for removing any permanent. I'm also running Deflecting Swat and Reverberate as some stack interaction, and most importantly, I'm running Red Elemental Blast. REB is important since our worst enemy in the deck is Cyclonic Rift, and nothing feels better than stopping someone's incredibly powerful board wipe with a single red mana. Goblin Bombardment finds a place in the deck as an easy way to remove Varchild at instant speed if you need to take control of all of the survivors, and as a way to use leftover survivors to finish off players or creatures. Goblin Welder is a great piece to recur any artifact that may have been removed, and Hanuar Garrison we're running since we have the other half of the meld in the deck anyway. For tutors, I'm running Goblin Recruiter and Goblin Matron since both can find a good chunk of important pieces for the deck, as well as Gamble to find whatever part of the deck you need. And finally, Blood Moon, which is the least important card for our deck to run, but great at punishing 4 to 5 color good stuff decks like Golos. For both ramp and card draw, Mono Red can struggle, but we do have some pretty helpful pieces. Cards that can do both are Chandra, Torch of Defiance, Solemn Simulacrum, Command Sphere, and Mind Stone. Our artifact ramp is Soul Ring, Felwar Stone, Ruby Medallion, and Gauntlet of Power, which also buffs all red creatures, including our opponent's survivors. Ways to ramp with combat are Curse of Opulence and Sword of the Animist. Dockside Extortionist does a great job ramping us in the early and late games, and lands that ramp us are Myriad Landscape and Thawing Glaciers. We have card draw on a creature through Dark Dweller Oracle, which is also both a sack outlet and a goblin. Artifacts that draw us cards are Endless Atlas and Chandra's Regulator, and equipments that do the same are Mask of Memory and Skull Clamp. I also run Wild Guess, Tormenting Voice, and Faithless Looting, as well as Reforge the Soul, which can refill our hand. And our card draw lands are Forgotten Cave, Smoldering Crater, Desert of the Fervent, and Gaia Reach Sanitarium. As far as lands go, besides the 21 basic lands and the ones that I mentioned earlier, I also run Command Tower, Zephyran Void, Command Beacon, Field of Ruin, Emergent Zone, and Thespian Stage. That's the deck as I run it, but I would like to talk about a few honorable mentions that work in the deck substituting for almost any card. For creatures, Loyal Apprentice is good to make blockers in the air. Goblin Diplomats is another goblin that can force attack, and Grenzo Havoc Razor, which rewards you for dealing combat damage, can be card advantage and force combat, as well as another goblin. Another neat choice is Rampaging Ferocidon, which could be rad if your playgroup doesn't track commander damage, because it doubles up all of Varchild's damage, pinging your opponents when they get survivors. For artifacts, I personally don't run Lightning Greaves, because it gives Varchild Shroud, which prevents you from suiting her up even further once she's on board, but it is an incredible piece of protection worth considering. For sorceries, there's World at War, which is an extra combat spell with rebound, meaning you get it again on your next turn. and Gravitic Punch, which can deal massive damage to a player if Varchild is suited up enough. A strange instant that is an interesting include is False Orders. Being a multiplayer game, False Orders allows you to mess with any combat step, including sneaking Varchild through or unblocking an attacking creature that would kill an opponent. And for lands, there's Endless Sands, which is a fun way to get Varchild's Leave the Battlefield trigger and get her onto the battlefield again rather cheaply. The deck itself is very fun to pilot and can lead to some interesting political choices as well. I often bargain to let Varchild in unblocked if I don't control any way to make her unblockable on board, and this is super helpful with cards like Sword of the Animist or Mask of Memory on board. The budget of this deck as I have it built is around $300 after shipping if you get the cheapest printing of everything available on TCG Player. But there are plenty of expensive pieces in the deck that can be easily substituted for something else, slimming down the budget. So yeah, this was me breaking down my favorite commander deck, Varchild, Betrayer of Kjeldor. I have the deck list linked in the description below, as well as my Twitter if you guys want to check it out. Check me out there. And thank you so much for watching my deck tech. See you guys all next time. Bye bye.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Yeah, well, just keep your power gloves off her, pal, huh?